This week on the question box, it's getting hot.
Sex, drugs, death, the end of the world. Should my kids believe in Santa? Is there fundamental meaning? Are aliens saved? What the hell was man? Question box, question box.
Hi friends, welcome again to the question box. This week I am in summer vacation mode and I am certainly not going to dress up for the internet, but I will tackle a question. And this week's question is a real doozy. The question, is it immoral or irresponsible to make babies when the world is literally on fire? Or metaphorically on fire, when the world is in some sense exploding. And this is a good one because, there's a lot of fears to consider when you think about bringing a child into the world. Is it right to bring kids into a world that is heating up, in a world that is being filled, overpopulated, in a world where the systems are not set up to be sustainable, and where the digital Babylons that rule over us are content to not actually put any energy into solving these crises that face the human race, but are instead happy to increase their profit margins every quarter? Is that a world you should bring children into? So on a personal level, let's take this personal. I know that when my office here gets cluttered and messy, I get overwhelmed. When I first moved into this office and I was trying to tidy everything up and put everything out, we'd had housemates for years. So this was one of my housemates' rooms. And when he moved out, we had to kind of, gut the room out and get everything in and try to organize it. And at first it just felt completely overwhelming. I had a whiteboard laying down and stacks of books, just hundreds of books, and it was messy. And I just, I felt like this was never going to come together. And let me tell you what I feel when I'm in a messy room that is a messy room of my own doing. First, I feel despair. And the despair is just looking at the sheer amount of work that is in front of me and the feeling that I'm never going to have enough time to deal with all of this. And so I'll just sit on the floor and stare at it for a while in despair at the state of my room. It's a disaster. And a second impulse that comes with despair is to distract. And so I pull out my phone and I maybe scroll for a little while sitting on the floor of the dirty room. Or I decide that I'm going to come back to the room after I go and watch some TV for a while. Or maybe I'll go listen to a podcast on a walk, or some other technology is going to now distract me from the problem that is at hand. So yes, the room is messy. And yes, it's going to be seemingly impossible to overcome the challenge I'm facing here. But then I have to just note that despair and distraction are going to come in as sort of spiritual forces that try to shape me in a way that takes me out of participation in the cleaning up of the room and pull my attention elsewhere. But when I actually want to get to the task of cleaning the room and trying to set some order to the chaos that is in here, I have to begin by having a vision of hope, a vision of hope of what my study could look like should it actually come together. And so you've got to spend some time thinking, what would a hopeful vision for this room be? What if I had that whiteboard on the wall? What if I could organize my thoughts on that whiteboard? What if these books were pared down and moved elsewhere so I could have just a few books that I'm actually currently engaging with in this space? What would it look like to put art and icons on the walls in order to remind me of what is true? What would it look like to have a special reading chair, just a special chair for me and my books and my morning coffee? And suddenly this hopeful vision actually begins to combat the mess. The mess is real. It is a disaster. It is not going well, and I don't think it's going to go well. However, this hopeful vision has produced in me something that draws me forward. I have a desire to clean it. I have a desire to make this a room that I can use. I have a desire now that I didn't have before, and that desire is beginning to do battle with that hopelessness, with that despair and with that distraction. That hope is saying, yes, the truth is that it is bad, and the truth is that you could go be distracted. Look how excited I'm getting just thinking about my vision of hope. It's all true, but if you take the next step, you will produce something that is worth putting your hope in. And that hopeful vision of reality always requires one faithful step, one step of faith into that. You have to say yes to one step into hope in order to go down that path and avoid despair or distraction. So in this study, for example, it's going to be saying to myself, I can't tackle everything, but I can figure out which books I want to keep here and which books I want to send elsewhere. I can't take care of everything, but I can make the phone call to get someone here to put up that whiteboard. And those steps of faith then begin to spiral me not into despair, but further and further into hope. Maybe you've experienced this. You don't want to clean your kitchen. You don't want to clean your kitchen. But once you actually start doing that first dish, you're like, well, now I got to do all the dishes. And once the dishes are done, you think, well, now I got to wipe down the countertops. And then you find yourself at 2 a.m. on your hands and knees, scrubbing, cleaning up the stove, doing something crazy because you got moving, because you got some momentum, because you're now living in hope, not living in despair. So how does all of this kind of work its way down to this particular question about having children? Before I go in, I do want to say that I just acknowledge that for some of you watching this, the topic of children is going to bring up some discomfort or some pain. Maybe you're somebody who thought having children would be natural or effortless, and instead you've gone down complicated journeys of fertility and miscarriages and grief and loss. And thank you for even watching this. I mean, if you're somebody who's gone down that path and you're watching this, that's just such a tremendous sign of strength and courage in you to even broach this topic, because when you're in that kind of pain, it's so hard to get outside of it. So thank you for those of you who are watching this. And I just want to acknowledge that pain. And for those of you also who are in relationships where fertility is either a challenge or due to you being in a same-sex relationship, fertility is going to look different for you. For some of you, maybe you thought you were going to get married and have children and you just never met that person that was going to become that partner. And so I want to acknowledge all of that. And when I talk about children, I'll start by talking about biological children. I'm kind of having children, the act of deciding to have children, but we'll get to a place pretty quickly where this moves beyond those who have their own biological children. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before getting into the question then of how this fits with children. Now, with all of that said, I believe that having children today, if you have children in this eyes wide open way, is one of the most courageous things you can do. I really believe that. Now, there are lots of people that are going to not think for a minute about global warming and just pop out kids, and that's fine, like no judgment on them, but it's not exactly courageous. Courage is seeing how bad things are getting. Courage is seeing how bad things are going to get. And courage is saying, without minimizing or avoiding the truth of the catastrophes we are facing, I choose in faith to step into a more hopeful future. And I choose to do that by actually bringing a young, vulnerable life into the world, giving myself over to the nurturing and raising and caring and worldview shaping of this young life to such a degree that I can send this young person into a world of darkness and trust that the darkness will not overcome them, but the light in these children I have raised will actually overcome that darkness. Tell me that's not a sign of faith. Tell me that's not a sign of hope. And you might think that that's false hope. And you might think that that's wasted faith. But I don't. But I don't. Because what is the other option? We all stop having children? Like, do we just all, like, why don't we all just go to the ocean and walk in together and see what, what are we going to just end ourselves? I mean, maybe that might be good for the earth at some level, but I've got to think that there's probably another plan. I don't want to start by walking into the ocean. I actually want to start by trying to make my neighborhood a little bit more a place of light. And I actually think that one of the best ways to do that is going to be having these children and raising them in this way of light so that they might become people of light who, Ted Lasso style, spread that light to everyone else around them until the entire consciousness does shift. This great idea of love and grace and mercy, this great idea of holiness and meaning. I want to birth that into the world. And the best way I can do that across generations, the best way I can birth that hope into the future is to make a baby and then raise the baby and lose all my money and my hair and all those kind of other things, But that is a sign of faith. That is how we kick at the darkness until it bleeds daylight, to quote Bruce Colburn. That is how we step into this faith and put it into action. And for the record, this is not something just for those of us who are breeders. That's not just for those of us who have our own biological children, at least in the church. And that's my world, the church. So, in the church, what we're trying to do, and we're not great at it, but we're really trying to do is create a community where the children do not belong just to their parents, but where the children are raised by a whole community. They're raised by teenagers and people in their 20s and people in their 50s and 60s. They've got grandparents who aren't their grandparents and parents who aren't their parents, where they've got spiritual siblings, spiritual parents, spiritual grandparents, where whole communities are together investing in these young people. You don't need to have kids yourself in order to seed this hope into the future. But you do need to be willing to receive the kids that God brings to you. You need to be able to receive your nieces or your nephews, the kids in your neighborhood. And if you don't have a place where you can receive those kids, try going to church. I mean, there's so many issues with it, and it kind of sucks sometimes, but it is a bit of a family vibe. And if you go and you invest yourself in those relationships, you'll find kids that want to hear from you and whose parents want you to become spiritual parents, aunts, uncles to them. This is something the people of God have always done. In the book of Jeremiah, when the Israelites, God's people in the Old Testament, are taken into exile, they are taken to the city of Babylon. They're taken away from their homes. They've lost. They're grieving. And you can see them sitting in Babylon thinking, should we continue to have children here? We are in slavery. We are in exile. We are in a foreign place. And we don't know if we're ever going to get to go back to the way things were. And it's the prophet Jeremiah who says to them, do not lose hope in Babylon. Do not lose hope. Build houses, plant gardens, marry off your children, and have more children. Because this moment of suffering is not the end of the story. And you can live in the future that is coming if now you are willing to take a step of faith and courageously step into that. I think that the prophet Jeremiah's spirit would speak to us today as well. Would say to us, don't be afraid of a world that is on fire. Don't feel like you need to despair, and don't feel like you need to distract yourself from it. Acknowledge the reality of what you're facing. We are in exile. The world is heating up. Things are falling apart. This is not looking good. And yet, in that place, don't lose hope. Because something is going to happen. Something is coming at us. To use biblical language, God has not abandoned us. He knows the plans he has for humanity. And those plans will come about when we step into them with hope and with acts of faith. Okay, and one final thing that is kind of interesting in this is that faith has a way of awakening more faith. When you step out in faith, and this doesn't need to be having children, when you give generously, even though it was like, ooh, that hurt, when you step out to connect with a neighbor who's maybe isolated, when you volunteer at a community garden or at a community center in your neighborhood, when you do these acts of faith into a hopeful world, they build more faith. And nowhere is this more true than with children. Like when you have kids in your life, at first, you think that you are teaching them something, but then, of course, you quickly realize you all know where I'm going with this. They are teaching you. You think you're waking them up to what the world is like, but actually, those kids are waking you up to reality. If you watch a kid play and get lost in play, you remember that even though the world is overwhelming and heating up and everything's falling apart, when you're present in play, none of that matters. It doesn't, not in that moment. When you watch your kids laugh and dance and you find yourself laughing and dancing, suddenly the weight of the world feels far less heavy. When you watch children grow up, you see yourself echoed in them. When you watch your niece, your nephew, the kids in your community growing up, you remember what it was like to be a kid, and some naivety, some hope, some joy is rebirthed in you. I have a son and a daughter. My daughter's going to be 5 on Saturday, and my son is going to be 2 in October. And before I had them, my wife and I were married for 10 years. And I get existential. You should know this about me. 3 episodes in, you probably are getting a sense of this. I get in my own head about things. I get into this. The world is ending. The powers and principalities have won. Jeff Bezos is going to be our new Lord and Savior. I get freaked out. And then I had kids. And having kids for me meant that I was spending more time in smaller spaces, hunched down on my knees, playing on the ground. And suddenly all the bigness of the world, all the fears, all that overwhelms me was far less interesting than playing with this 1.5-year-old in this particular moment. That these small moments were enough. And this is, I think, why Jesus, at least part of why Jesus said, if you want to live in the kingdom of God, if you want to live in the light, in the way, in flourishing and abundant life, if you want to live in that life now, you need to become like a child. You need to become like a child, which means we probably should keep having children. We probably should, with eyes wide open, keep bringing little bursts of awakening into the world in faith that a better way is possible. And as you do it, you're going to become less and less overwhelmed by this world. You're going to begin to find more and more flourishing. And there are a number of practices that you can implement into your life to allow yourself to not just feel like the world is bad and you're going to do your little good, but to actually start feeling like maybe the world isn't as crushing and overwhelming a place as you thought it was, that maybe there's more light than darkness in this world. But as for what those practices are, it's another question. It's another question for another question box. And with that, we have another episode of the Question Box in the box. Thanks so much for listening to this. It's been a blast to do. Even when in summer vacation, I'm kind of enjoying this process. So on Monday, I'll post another question box on my Instagram. Submit your questions on there, or if you're watching this on YouTube, in the comments below. And on Tuesday, I will post a poll between the 2 questions I like the most. Whichever one wins will be what I respond to in next Thursday's video. You can also find these now in podcast form. Just search for The Question Box with Kevin Makins, and all the episodes will be there in your podcast feed. And just a reminder that if you liked this video, make sure to go and take a nap, because you're probably tired and you never nap. You never nap, and you should. So try to get 10 minutes, and I'll see you all next week. Peace.